So in the first segment, we sort of just give you a quick overview of operations management and sort of ended with this concept that it involves a reconciliation of market requirements with your operations resources. So where those two meet is where we create the strategy that allows us to meet the performance objectives for marketing. So what some successful companies have done, let's just take a look at some examples. What they tend to do is when they want to stay ahead of their customers, they search relentlessly for competitive advantage, and some of that competitive advantage can come from operations. They leverage new and emerging technology, they view the workforce as a strategic asset, they innovate, develop a razor-sharp focus on key market segments, and they seek competitive advantage from operations. Examples, your Southwest Airlines, Walmart, Toyota, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Apple, Samsung. There are many companies that are out there. One of the things that would be interesting is to take a look at Southwest Airlines' low-cost competitive advantage kind of configuration, and you begin to see some of what we were talking about in terms of how you configure operations to support a particular competitive position. So Southwest wants to achieve low-cost advantage, and so if we look at some of the things that the way in which it's configured its service, we'll see that you have courteous but limited passenger service. Short haul point to point routes, often to secondary airports. Frequent reliable schedules, a standardized fleet, high aircraft utilization, productive employees. So you see elements of HR and the employees, aircraft utilization, so the equipment and scheduling, the standardized fleet, Boeing 357. So that is the equipment, the schedules, frequent reliable schedules, the sort of short haul point to point routes and so forth. And then, of course, courteous but limited passenger service in terms of your service offerings and the notion of what is your service quality construct, right? And then there are particular things under each of those that it does. So to achieve that, limited service means no seat assignments, no baggage transfers, using automated ticketing machines, and no meals. Well, everything is designed to drive costs down, right? In terms of short haul point to point, well, you have lower gate costs, and then a higher number of flights sort of reduces employee time between the flights. Okay, because a secondary airport, a little less traffic than a busy international airport, then you could actually have access to ground operations a lot more quickly, which then brings about faster turnaround times. High number of flights reduces employee time between the flights, saturate the city with flights, flowering the administrative cost per passenger for that city. So if you have a lot of flights in there, and you have the same administrative structure working, then you sort of get economies of scale. The more flights you have, the more you get economies of scale. Yeah. Well, pilot training one type of aircraft in terms of reduced maintenance inventory required because of one type of aircraft, then you develop good supplier relations because you're buying one type of aircraft from one person, and then even you have Boeing aiding in funding. A high aircraft utilization, so flexible employees and standard planes aid scheduling, flexible union contracts, maintenance personnel trained only on one type of aircraft, and then there's a sort of a 15-minute gate turnaround benchmark that is adhered to. Lean productive employees, well, high level of stock ownership. If you give them ownership, they become more productive because the greater the productivity, the greater the value of the stock. High for attitude, so you make sure that people have the right attitude and then you train them for what you want. High employee compensation, so make sure that they're well paid, empower them, and of course, by using automated ticket machines, you could help to sort of lower your costs and so forth. So these are just some things to take a look at in the case of Southwest Airlines. So operations-based strategy. Sometimes some people figure that when you define your strategy, your competitive advantage, or how you intend to compete, a lot of folks tend to go after marketing and then, by trying to sell customers and influence their behaviors and patterns. But sometimes you could look to operations as not just a matter of being supportive of a competitive strategy, but actually driving the competitive strategy itself. All right? And so operations-based strategy It was written in an article by Hayes and Upton, and you could find this on the Harvard Business Review's website called Operations-Based Strategy. So you could use it in the following ways, which is to assist you in positioning your product or service that is appealing to a different need. Or you could actually compete on the basis of capabilities, being better than somebody else. So Taco Bell versus McDonald's. So if Taco Bell is trying to be better than McDonald's in terms of its operations, or Walmart was better than Kmart in terms of managing the supply chain and gaining competitive advantage through the management of that supply chain. You could focus on process-based capabilities. You could focus on system-based capabilities like accounting knowledge and so on. Organization-based capabilities. You're able to set up new plans, design and introduce new products and so forth, like Sony's and Apple's and so forth, and the Samsungs were quite good at product introduction. Now you see how BlackBerry, for example, have not been able to keep pace with the rate at which these guys introduce new products into the market. So to some extent, that is operations-based strategy for product design and innovation. So it has a lot of work to do to catch up with these guys. Operations-based advantages are difficult to replicate because they require major change in efforts and realignment of systems and processes internally. So Upton and Hayes, they argue that when you compete in operations too, that it is not immediately visible as well, and so your competitors can't see that easily, and for them to actually mimic, they have to make a lot of internal changes, and so that poses a barrier. And I think Porter talks about that in his article, which then forces trade-offs because of the configuration of your operation system. Operations-based strategies are dynamic and emergent in character. They evolve through experimentation and learning. They can be used to develop defensive strategies too. Exploit one's strengths to attack a competitor. You can certainly do that. Attack a competitor's operating-based weaknesses. So if a competitor requires high volumes of sales to achieve economies of scale, but you have figured out a way to be very flexible and you could actually produce lower volumes, then certainly you could actually attack that person. Or you could emulate the attacker's strategy before it gets too far ahead of the learning curve. Again, it might be difficult, but it's not impossible. All right. Some summative comments in terms of operations-based strategy is that operations-based capabilities cannot be developed quickly and can't be bought off the shelf. Right? The fact that operations-based strategies capabilities take long to develop and can come together quite suddenly provides competitive advantage. Effective attackers are quick to recognize operating weaknesses. Effective defenders are quick to recognize latent threats. A critical success factor is the ability to learn and be creative. So you're aware, you analyze what a competitor is doing, and you're able to take action. And while it may be good to emulate best practices can be constraining because new practices are created all the time. So therefore, you should be seeking new practices. All right. What are some of the contributions of OM to strategy? And I'm sure if you look at some different companies, you'll see aspects of the 10 decision areas of OM, like Sony's constant innovation of new products, so flexibility in design. You have Compaq is no longer existing anymore, but Southwest Airlines no-frills service, low cost, Pizza Hut 5-minute guarantee at lunchtime, speed and dependability for FedEx. So these are just examples. Motorola's automotive products and ignition systems, conformance to quality, pages, performance, IBM's after-sales service on mainframe, So, but pages are sort of less prevalent these days. The point you're seeing here is that all these areas that emphasize different performance objectives such as flexibility, low cost, delivery, quality, after-sales service, they tend to be, they're driven and supported by these 10 decision areas of OM. Okay, so in really beginning to put the strategy together, we must understand the market. If you go back to Slack and Lewis's assertion that there has to be this alignment between marketing and operations. So high levels of quality, customers are looking for that. sometimes flexibility, high levels of service, low cost, quick response, little or no variability, they want consistency. But that mix depends on the market segment that you're serving. All right, some people are willing to give up certain levels of quality for lower cost. Some people are willing to give up a certain amount of speed for lower cost. If you want to pay $50 to have same day delivery, or you could pay $20 and have next day delivery. So that's the trade-off right here, as an example. Okay. When it comes to services, much of what we've talked about also applies to services, but you may want to ask a few questions. What are some of the common characteristics of the market segments when you're trying to actually design your service strategy for? What dimensions can be used to segment the market, demographic, psychographic, etc.? How important are these segments? What needs do each of them have? And how well are these needs being served in what manner by whom? So when you're beginning to develop operation strategy in a service environment, you got to just do the market segmentation, understand the market needs. And these are just some questions that you could ask to do that. Okay. In shaping your business strategy, since we talk about business strategy, unit strategy has to come before the operations or the functional strategies, then one will go through the process of developing a business strategy. I won't get into the details because really you will come across this in a course on strategy, but typically you would look at the environment, industry environment, competitive environment, the industry structure, critical success factors, the value chain of the company. All that information is very critical in developing appropriate strategy and so on. I'm going to skip some of those things that allow us to really develop more corporate strategy, and I want to get into the formal process of developing an operation strategy. Of course, a business unit will have strategies, generic strategies, and Paul will talk about that in his book on strategy. Low cost, right? Cost, or you could have a focus strategy, you could have cost leadership, or if you really look at that article that you have to read on what is strategy, where he talks about needs-based, varieties-based, and access-based, there's actually some correlation between this new terminology and the old one that you see right here that Porter introduced a few years ago. All right. So in terms of how you compete, cost leadership, of course, is basically just simply offering the cheapest products. It's good for mature products, and the firms must have access to capital to make investments in production assets, scale and design products for efficient manufacture, high level of expertise in process engineering, efficient distribution channels. So ways of keeping your costs down must be present. If you're going to compete on differentiation, then things like quality, innovation, delivery, service, flexibility, then you have to be able to offer customers something unique that differentiates you from another product. Excuse me. Value added may allow the firm to charge a premium. So if you actually could add something more than a commodity, then you might be able to charge more. All right. So because of product uniqueness, suppliers increase their prices, which can be passed on to consumers if there are few substitutes, and so forth. In terms of a service, the same strategies actually apply. You could compete on cost, or you could compete on differentiation, and there are ways to do that. If I were to just go back one minute, competing on cost, seek out low-cost customers, standardize a custom service, reduce the personal element in the service, so basically you just have everything standardized, reduce network costs, and taking service operations offline. So are ways to try to reduce costs associated with that. And then, of course, if you want to have differentiation, well, if you can make an intangible very tangible by the sort of ancillary activities or what you add to the service. For example, I recall one day when I brought my car in to get fixed, and then realized, and then there was a company that was actually driving you to work and would pick you back up. Well, that was quite exciting. But then pretty soon everybody was able to match that. And then you have the other ones that fix your car, that's a service. But then they also then would wash your car and then give a kind of a little light detailing of it, and that's like, but then that's very high in service, places like Mercedes Benz and so forth. So they add a little something. Maybe they might even put a gift in the car, something like that. So I'm just saying that you could actually make a a standard service slightly more memorable. Okay. I want to just talk a bit about the role of operations in operations strategy. And a couple of things to think about is that we could consider um, 4 different roles that basically speaks to the level of engagement. Operations can be viewed as internally neutral, which is basically just minimize the negative potential of operations. If we could create scrap, if we could have bad products and so on that could fail in the market, well, let's try to minimize that. And so it's more reactive to changes in business strategy, and you're monitoring your costs and performance, and you just want to make sure that you stay at the bare minimum. You're internally neutral. Externally neutral, well, you want some parity with your competitors. You want to keep up to date, so you look at what they're doing and you do the same thing. But then you can become internally supported. That is, provide some credible support to your business strategy. So as your business strategy changes, you change as well, and make sure that there is a fair amount of support. But now externally supportive would be not just in terms of business unit strategy, but actually pursuing operations-based competitive advantage, where you're looking for ways to assist the organization in competing with competitors through operations. All right, and these are 4 possibilities. And of course, externally supportive requires a lot of work and soul searching. So what's involved in strategic operations planning if we wanted to do this? Here we see a number of elements of that process. One is that we could conduct the sort of build a corporate strategy where you do a PESTA analysis, industry analysis, competitive analysis, and so on. Determine what your critical success factors ought to be, what your customer needs are, and your sources of competitive advantage right here. And then from that, you get what your performance criteria are. So remember, by understanding your customer needs, this is where you get into the market requirements. And now you're going to get into the operations capabilities so that you have some reconciliation between those 2 things, right? So determine what the performance criteria are, right? And then what are the order winners and order qualifiers, which I will define shortly. Actually, this is where the sort of final set of market requirements are stipulated. Then we look at how well we're doing on these market objectives, and we get a sense of what our performance gaps are. We then go to our operations infrastructure and try to reconcile our capabilities so that we can meet the performance objectives that are stipulated at this point. So we do value chain analysis. And by value chain analysis, we look at aspects of the organization. The same 10 decision areas of OM are parts of your value chain, right? And then you figure out what the weaknesses are internally and what changes you have to make to strengthen them. And we can refer to those as infrastructural objectives, which you will then improve. And hopefully when you develop your improvement strategy and you implement them, you're better able to achieve your performance. So actually after implementation, we should have a line going this way that helps to now drive and improve performance. All right? This is a diagram taken from a paper by Garvin where he just shows much the same thing. A model of a manufacturing strategy, you have the corporate strategy, the business unit strategy, and then instead of, if we want to generalize, we can see the operation strategies right here. If we want to generalize it for services and manufacturing. Then you have the policies, which would be operations policies, and those policies are in the context of the 10 decision areas of OM. Slightly different terminology, but it's much the same thing. Capacity, facilities, technology, structure, human resources, etc., etc. Production, supply chain management, maintenance, all those things can be in here. And then, of course, you then provide some feedback on how you've configured your resources, and that feedback is fed to the manufacturing strategy, and the evaluation process is iterative. It just goes on and on and on. All right. If you are going to develop a strategy, an operation strategy for services, there are a few questions you could ask. What are important elements of the strategy? Right. On which will the most effort be concentrated? For example, once you've identified what your service concept is, then are you going to emphasize operations, finance, marketing, the organizational structure, HR, etc.? How will quality and cost be controlled, measured? What kind of incentives would you have? Rewards would you offer? What are the results? What results would be expected versus competition in terms of quality, quality of service, costs, profile, productivity, morale, loyalty of service, etc. So there's just some nuances in terms of the design of the service strategy, but they're sort of fairly similar. So here's a summary of the operations strategy. Identify market segments, excuse me, that your business unit is serving. Look at the firm's value proposition for each of these markets, and then identify what we call the external performance objectives. So in other words, what are you offering that market? Is it speed? Is it cost? Is it low cost? Is it flexibility? Is it dependability, reliability? Okay, flexibility and so on. And then we actually look at the list of things that we want to offer in our value proposition and separate them into what we call the order winners. The order winners are essentially what gets you to win the business. Auto qualifiers is what you need to enter the market. So, for example, if I want to run a 100-meter race, I got to qualify. Maybe my time might need to be sub 10 or just around 10 seconds for a 100 meter. But then to win, I have to be the fastest person. Okay? Assess the current performance on these objectives. Then perform a SWOT analysis on the operations value chain to find out where your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities are. Then you identify those weaknesses that are constraining your ability to win on the order winners. And then you make some recommendations for some strategies. You leverage your strengths, and then you enhance your weaknesses to address the situation. Develop an improvement plan, implement it, monitor it. So the process looks fairly similar to a strategic planning process, except that we are looking at it in the context of operations as opposed to at the level of the corporation as a whole. All right? So we will stop here with this segment on the summary of an operations strategy formulation process. And then we will continue in the third and final segment on operations strategy.